So why is Ken Ham attacking other young Earth creationists? That is the topic for today's stream. I've got Dr. Marcus Ross on with me today. He's been on the show before. He was actually at our CCV2 conference debating Michael Jones from Inspiring Philosophy on young Earth creationism, evolution, and Genesis. And so, but there's been some recent kind of news that's happened in the last few weeks, I suppose, where Ken Ham and Answers in Genesis has sort of been targeting other young Earth creationists, saying that they're kind of going toward or starting to compromise on God's word. And so that's what we'll be talking about today is some of the recent attacks that have been made. In the thumbnail, I've kind of got like civil war. You know, is there a sort of civil war brewing in the young Earth creationist community? But Dr. Ross, I'd like to, since this is only your second time on the show, a lot of the audience won't really be familiar with you or your work. So I just wanted to give you a brief introduction at the very beginning and just allow you about 60 seconds and just tell the audience a little bit about who you are.
Well, thanks, Cameron. It's a delight to be back on. And I had a delightful time with you guys at the Capturing Christianity 2 conference. The debate with Mike Jones was just really well run. You did a great job as moderator. And it was just a wonderful experience. You know, two people who both love the Lord, are passionate about scripture and about science and about, rationality and reasons and apologetics. And I thought it was just a very substantive and very good debate. So thanks for inviting me to that. For those who haven't seen or met me before, I am a paleontologist by training and a geologist as well. I'm also a young Earth creationist, and those two are not frequently often thought together, but there's actually a pretty substantial little community of us who are. My background is in the sciences. I went to Penn State University, South Dakota School of Mines and Tech for a master's degree in paleontology, and then University of Rhode Island for my PhD, and working in vertebrate paleontology. I worked on animals with backbones, and in particular, mosasaurs. These were the groups of animals. If you've seen Jurassic World, the big swimming marine reptile in there, that's one of the guys that I studied, although they're not quite as large in real life as they end up on the movies. But I've been active in young Earth creationism for a very long time. During both my undergraduate and graduate programs, I dabbled a bit in creation issues, but not very much, since I was kind of a vulnerable student, very vulnerable at some times. But then when I graduated, I started working at Liberty University, and I taught courses in earth science, geology, paleontology, and creation studies. And I also served as the director of the Center for Creation Studies there from 2017 to 2021. In 21, I stepped down from teaching academically because my wife and I had started a science educational supply company a few years before that, and it had grown to the point where, we kind of felt like we could do this as our job. So I run Cornerstone Educational Supply, and so the illustrious background behind me here is one of our offices here at the warehouse, where we produce science supplies for private and public schools, homeschoolers, colleges, universities, publishers, a wide variety of different folks. So that's a bit of my background. I'm an evangelical Christian, been so since my youth, but grew up in a spiritually mixed household. My father's an agnostic. My mom came to Christ after my sister and I were born, not too long after that. So I grew up in the church, but I also grew up with someone very close to me who doesn't see the world the way that I do. And I've always felt that helped give me some additional perspective in the way to approach apologetics issues, because there's people that I love very much who disagree with me on some topics, and I want to be able to present those topics in a way that doesn't push them away, that shows them that I love and care about them, and that connects not just to my immediate family, but to the other people that I've met. Having evolutionists, for example, who were agnostic or atheist evolutionists, who were my roommates, right, who are my office mates, my co-authors and co-workers, people I care for, because they're people that are made in the image of God. They're people for whom Christ died. So my approach to issues in creation is certainly passionate. Anybody who was there at the Capturing Christianity debate knows that I'm a passionate advocate for young Earth creationism, but I also hope to be one that is somewhat winsome in the approach that I take.
Yeah, and I have to say, it was great to meet you, and just to dialogue with someone. I've been thinking all day about like, how do I word this in a way that doesn't come across as offensive? But my upbringing was very much young Earth sort of creationist. There were a lot of assumptions that kind of went into that. And as I discovered apologetics, William Lane Craig and most of these guys that are evangelical and doing apologetics, very few, if not, I don't know of really any of the big apologists that are, that would identify as Young Earth. And I mean, I've even done some sort of preliminary reading on the topic myself. It's not like an active area of research for me. I think I've read like a 4 Reviews book on reading Genesis 1 and 2. And even in reading that book, the Young Earth Creationists that they had contributing in that book, I think it was Beale was his name. I can't, Todd Beale, something like that. I remember reading it, and I remember thinking like, this doesn't strike me as like the strongest case that's been made in the book. But anyways, when I came in touch with you, which was actually through our mutual friend Josh Swamidas, he was like, you got to get Dr. Ross on if you can to defend the Young Earth position. And after you came and you did the debate in the conference, and also you and I were able to connect while we were at the conference, I kind of realized that there is like a faction of Young Earth creationists that, I mean, when you and I were talking, it didn't strike me as like you being irrational or unreasonable. I think that you, just like someone like William Lane Craig, are just honestly trying to assess the data and come to a reasonable conclusion. And it wasn't as if you just had like these sort of fundamentalist assumptions that were going into it, and you're just denying, you're calling God a liar. Like you weren't using those sorts of tactics and that kind of thing. So anyway, it was just a sort of breath of fresh air to be able to connect with you and to hear your perspective. That's part of the reason why I'm so excited to have you back on the show. And that's one of the goals for this show, is to point people in the direction, if you're interested in this topic, point people in direction to some good sort of Young Earth creationist resources that if they're interested in this topic, they can go and investigate what are the reasons that people like yourself are offering in defense of this view. But before we get to that, we'll get to that. I'm sure throughout the show we'll be referencing things here and there. But let's kind of get to the meat of the discussion, which is all about what's sort of happening this is a little bit of like apologetics drama, or like theology drama that's kind of going on. But nevertheless, I think it's important to address. So why don't you start us off, kind of tell us what's going on here?
Yeah, it definitely is an in-house debate, and unfortunately, it's become one that's a little bit on the ugly side within Young Earth creationism. So, beginning in late January, Answers in Genesis began a series of articles critiquing a group of people that they are calling Young Earth evolutionists, or YEEs. Now, on the face of it, that's a strange term to create. I mean, Young Earth creationism, we kind of know at least what that is, right? Whether, no matter kind of where you stand within Young Earth creationism, it's a fairly narrow, bullseye here, right? You believe that the Earth is relatively young, measured only in ages of thousands of years rather than billions. You believe in historical Adam with a cosmic fall. You believe in a global flood at the time of Noah that deposits some large portion of the geological record, right? These are like, the official tie points that make somebody a Young Earth creationist. And everybody that Answers in Genesis is critiquing affirms those things, right? We're not talking about anybody who's saying, well, maybe the Earth is actually many millions of years old, but maybe only life is very young, or something like that. They're not blending weird, ages and dates or a non-global flood or anything. Everybody's well within the target area of what counts as Young Earth creationism. Mm-hmm. But what Answers in Genesis is upset about, and they've been upset about it for a while, it's finally just spilled out. It's one of those like, we can't take it anymore. We just got to go after these people. Is that you've got a group within Young Earth creationism, and I guess I'd probably be part of that group as well, although I haven't been mentioned in this article or series.
Not yet.
No, not yet. Now I hope not, because it's just a headache. But at the same time, I've got a lot of good friends who are having their names dragged through the mud here for reasons that are, I don't think, very legitimate. Really, what it boils down to is, are you willing to concede that evolution might have some evidence in its favor? And are you willing to agree with evolutionists sometimes about the way in which certain data are interpreted? Now, again, we're not talking about somebody agreeing that the Earth is ancient. We're not talking about somebody agreeing that there's universal common ancestry. We're talking about, do you think sometimes evidence, is best explained by an evolutionary or old age argument rather than a young Earth one? And the answer to that should be yes, there are evidences that are better interpreted. I don't necessarily mean that that's the correct interpretation, but right now it might seem the most natural. Or you might agree, as I do with my evolutionary colleagues, that there are a bunch of different dinosaur species that have feathers on them. And this one keeps popping up like top of the list, which is really kind of weird for Answers in Genesis. Like, no,
the thing that they take issue with. Yeah.
Yeah. And you kind of think, well, this doesn't actually have any real bearing on whether the Earth is young or biological evolution or anything like that. It just simply should be a question of, are there anatomically recognized dinosaurs that possess anatomically recognizable feathers? And if the answer is yes, then the answer is yes, right? And if the answer is no, then the answer is no. But in part because, organizations like Answers in Genesis and some of the other big creation ministries have been arguing against dinosaurs with feathers for so long. Now that we've got something like 50 to 60 species with feather-like integument, they just kind of say, no, it can't be. They're either birds or they're dinosaurs, or the feathers aren't really feathers. I think they've just kind of gotten into a rut of, we have to keep up the same argument because otherwise we're not going to be consistent with ourselves. And Answers in Genesis in particular is very, very interested in maintaining consistency with itself and not changing something that it said in the past. That's not a good practice when you're dealing with science in particular, right? Or if you're dealing with archaeology and discovering history, right? There are facts that can change the way that we look at things. And Answers in Genesis right now is saying, no, if you agree with evolutionists on a particular interpretation of some data, then you are giving them ammunition and you're confusing the people at the church, because now there's a creationist saying that something in evolution makes sense or was correct. And the person in the pew is simply going to get confused, and they're going to think, well, maybe the Bible's wrong. It's a pretty big jump to go from that one to the other, but it's one that's being made in these articles. And like I've said, there's a series now. They've been coming out every week on Friday afternoons from mid-late January up through right now and continuing on. We're a little past the halfway point in them, apparently.
Well, why don't we turn to one of them now? We've got one pulled up. I think this is this the latest one? Yeah, it's from March 3rd, I believe. So maybe it's not the very latest, but nevertheless, we can kind of take a look at what's going on here in this article from Answers in Genesis. So I noticed the kind of thing.
Oh, sorry about
later
that.
on. Yeah, let me just say this real quickly.
Yeah. Sorry.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
All right. So yeah, in the context here, the articles have been going on for about 6 weeks at this point. And then Ken Ham himself decides to write this one. So all of the other articles in the series have been written as a ministerial position sort of thing. They've technically been anonymous. The first one came under the name of one of their writers, Harry Sanders III. And it's very clear from the writing that he's the lead writer for this sort of stuff. But part of what Ken Ham actually does in this is say, no, it's not just one person. There's a whole bunch of researchers and whatnot working on this. This is a ministry statement. But Ken Ham is stepping into the middle of this series because he's been getting, and Answers in Genesis has been getting pushback from other people saying, hey, what you're doing here is pretty terrible. So Ken Ham is stepping into the middle of this with a long article to reorient and let people know why Answers in Genesis feels justified in going through with this series.
What I was going to say is that something that you were mentioning earlier on, like the sort of key points that they're wanting to attack become clear in this section of the article. Let me see if I can get most of it on the screen here. And as you can see, some creationists, the first bullet point that they say, some of the main items we're concerned about are summarized as follows. Number one, some creationists have accepted the idea that dinosaurs had feathers, which again is kind of like you said, it's a little bit strange to put so much emphasis on this unless you kind of understand, if you have the background that Answers in Genesis has been arguing for a long time now that dinosaurs don't have feathers, and that's kind of been their sort of resounding argument they've been making, as a sort of shtick that they've got at this point. I don't really have any problem with consistency per se, but it's like you said, once you come across new data, you've got to be able to be open to adjusting your views based on that data. And especially when in something like this, it doesn't matter with respect to whether or not young Earth creationism is true. It doesn't matter if dinosaurs had feathers. It's like you can just accept the evidence and follow it where it leads. Unless they've got some other reason, or like you said, there's just a sort of history of making an argument against this, and they don't want to cause confusion on the people that have been supporting their ministry. I don't know.
Yeah, and on the issue of causing confusion, I find people are actually fairly smart. One of the things that bothers me a bit about this series with this whole kind of man in the pew sort of thing, it's a term that's used in a couple of the different articles, that this hypothetical man in the pew is just going to be horribly confused, has a really low view then of people in church. We happen to live in the most literate and educated society pretty much that has ever been on the planet, right? Us and other societies where literacy is widespread. There's lots of information. The people who are in our churches today know the Bible better than most people who had been in churches over the past centuries. It's not to say that the people before that were dumb, right? But a lot of people in the past simply weren't literate, and so they couldn't pick up a Bible and read it on their off time. They went to church, they went to mass, they went to chapel, and they heard, and they might have recited some things and whatnot, but they didn't get a big, huge picture of the Bible. And a lot more Christians today have a good and better understanding of the Bible than people did in the past. So to make this argument that somebody in the pew is going to be swayed simply because somebody with a PhD comes up and says, I'm a creationist and this is something, and then they think, well, now you guys are all going to be confused. Oh man, I never viewed my students that way. As a college professor, my view of my students was these folks are smart. I'm here to help teach them new things that they don't know. But I sure don't hope that they simply accept it because I've got a degree and a credential up front. It's because what I'm saying actually comports with reality, right? It makes sense of the world around them in some way. So that's one of the things that troubles me. Now with the dinosaurs and the feathers things, something that Ken Ham brings up in this article a few times is that these dangerous creationists, these young Earth evolutionists, which again, kind of doesn't exist, they've taken on evolutionary assumptions. This is a typical terminology that you see at Answers in Genesis. We have to avoid evolutionary assumptions.
Yeah, let me actually pull that part of the article up here. It's right here. There it is. Where
there we go.
There we go. Creationists have accepted some false evolutionary assumptions that have led to what we believe is error in a number of areas they believe and teach.
Yeah. So, one of the things that we have here, right, this is titled 11 warning, which, right off the bat is a pretty powerful scare tactic, right? Jesus warns his disciples in Matthew 16, beware the leaven of the Pharisees. Of course, they don't know what's going on. They're like, we don't have any bread. Right? Jesus like, guys, come on, think about this for a minute. And so beware the teachings of the Pharisees. So apparently the young Earth evolutionists, these dangerous creationists are Pharisees in this, which is really, really kind of nasty insinuation here. But I think it's really interesting here. I mean, do you think that it's really likely that some of the young Earth creationists who are the best trained in their field and have been young Earth creationists for a really long time have actually bought into evolutionary assumptions about things? That seems kind of remote in terms of the realms of possibility. On the face of it, it's kind of absurd. We're talking about people who have, a history of affirming all the things that we talked about before about this. And instead, I would say that, what is happening here is that young Earth creationists like myself with the issue of, say, dinosaurs and feathers, have been making the argument that these organisms possess these things on the basis of anatomy, on the basis of chemical signatures in the rocks. We actually have chemical identification of the type of materials that make up the feathers. You might have heard of the substance called keratin. Keratin is what makes up our fingernails and our hair. It makes up hooves on animals, makes up feathers on birds. Well, feathers are unique in that they only have one form of keratin that makes up the whole thing, beta keratin, whereas our fingernails and our hair, for example, has both what's called alpha and beta keratin. So if you're finding something in the fossil record and you have a chemical signature that is consistently and only beta keratin, well, the only structure we have in the present world that has that is feather. So it's not an evolutionary assumption to make the argument that these structures that look like feathers and are composed only of beta keratin are feathers. It's a good anatomical comparison, right? That's comparative anatomy right there. And it doesn't seem that the folks at Answers in Genesis quite understand that. They have a rather poor understanding in this case of organismal biology and of comparative anatomy. And they think that because modern comparative anatomists are evolutionists, therefore the entire field is just riddled with evolutionary assumptions. But comparative anatomy existed before there was evolutionary theory. Darwin proposed evolution to explain the sorts of patterns and features amongst nature that he already saw before he himself began holding to evolution. So, organisms are the data out there, and our interpretations of them come certainly through assumptions, but they also come through reasonable explanations. And so this idea about assumptions is really weird, because I don't assume evolution when I assume that what I'm looking at on a fossil plaque is a feather. I am merely assuming that the shape and the chemical composition that shows an identical form to something like a modern feather means that we've got a preserved feather. So the assumptions here are not evolutionary ones that are going in here. The fact that I might agree with an evolutionist, I think, is what it really comes down to. And I don't think that Ken Ham or the writers of this series seem to be able to wrap their minds around the fact that you could agree with an evolutionist about something without you yourself being an evolutionist or falling into a trap in some way.
Yeah, I think the kind of like driving force, the inference that's going on here is actually just a sort of a straightforward slippery slope fallacy, where it's like if you allow any kind of foot in the door, that's going to slippery slide all the way down to you accepting old earth creationism, to you accepting evolution and all those things. And what you're kind of saying is that well, I guess there's two sort of responses you could give. Is that A, that's really just a slippery slope fallacy, but B, it doesn't actually follow that these assumptions that are being made, if you even want to call them assumptions, are going to lead to that at all. And so it's a little bit it's a little bit reactionary, I would say, instead of, I don't know. It doesn't really strike me as a very serious concern. I can understand. It almost strikes me as a sort of way of almost like a sort of defense mechanism, something along those lines, where they want to defend kind of some of the things, like you said, their own maybe reputation or some of the other things that they've argued. I don't know. I don't really see this as a very serious challenge.
I think you're onto something with that. I mean, slippery slope arguments, I think, honestly get a little bit of a bad rap because they get used poorly, but not because they are inherently wrong. Well, let me put it this way, right? I think that slippery slope arguments work properly when you see that a certain conclusion that you're drawing out of, whatever construct you're working within, if you decide to stop arbitrarily without following the logic all the way down, then you can make a pretty good slippery slope argument. It's like, hey, you're stopping here simply because you want to, when the logical conclusion does bring you to some other point. What we've got with this, I think, is rather, no, we're agreeing with an evolutionist about a particular fossil, right? And Answers in Genesis agrees with evolutionists about fossils all the time. If somebody says this is a fossil of a Tyrannosaurus Rex, the chances of it being a young Earth creationist who is, discovered and identified and displaying this is pretty low. So if you go to the Smithsonian Museum and you look at their new Tyrannosaurus Rex and you say, look at that Tyrannosaurus Rex, you are agreeing with an evolutionist on his interpretation or her interpretation of that data. And so in this case, what we've got is simply being able to agree with, did somebody do proper work? Did somebody, find something that we can assign to this particular name and this particular thing? And, when it comes to dinosaurs and feathers, can we call this a dinosaur? And I'll say, sure, yeah, we've got 6, 7 different families of dinosaurs with individuals that have identifiable feathers. So sure, we can say that dinosaurs had feathers. Does this mean that birds evolved from feathers? No. Is that a slippery slope argument that because dinosaurs have feathers, therefore dinosaurs evolved into birds? No, those are different types of claims. So some slippery slope arguments I think work in a sense because somebody is stopping along the claim line, right? But these are two very different claims. One is simply a claim about anatomy, and the other one is a claim about organismal history. And those, speaking as a paleontologist, I've got to understand the difference between those two. Because while one might be inferred from the other, the data and the inference are separate things.
What it seems to me is going on here is that they've got their own. I mean, you could call it they have evolutionary assumptions as well that they share with evolutionists. For example, this is going to seem really obvious, but like young Earth creationists, like Answers in Genesis, and evolutionists both agree that an Earth exists, right? So that there are some assumptions that are shared between both of these camps regardless. And what they want to say is that where they draw the line, where they draw the line between their own view and the evolutionary view, like they want to say that their set of assumptions, their set of shared assumptions between the two camps, that's the correct one. Whereas the assumptions that you're sharing with evolutionists, that goes too far. But I think in my view, and I think probably in your view as well, is that it's going to be very difficult to make an actual reason or argument for this one set of assumptions, theirs, the Answers in Genesis set of assumptions, as being the only appropriate assumptions that someone can share with an evolutionist. You're saying that no, you can still believe, for example, that dinosaurs had feathers, and that's not going to lead toward old Earth creationism or accepting evolution or anything like that. So I think it's just do you think that helps sort of frame the issue? Is that, to me, it kind of seems like they're being a little bit arbitrary in the set of assumptions that they're saying are okay to share with evolutionists and the set that are not okay to share with them. And you're kind of saying that, no, it's totally fine to share some of them, right? I mean, you Answers in Genesis, you share a set of assumptions as well. It's just a matter of, where do we draw the line? And maybe that's an open question, but it's not as if just because Answers in Genesis has traditionally defended some set of assumptions, that doesn't mean that makes it the correct set. I don't know. Does that help, you think, frame the issue at all?
I think it does. One of the things that Answers in Genesis and other creationist organizations, myself, what I've told my students, is that we all share the same data. It's primarily the interpretations of those data that differ between, right? My PhD advisor at the University of Rhode Island, David Fostovsky, was an agnostic, secular Jewish evolutionist. And he took on as a graduate student a theistic, Gentile, young Earth creationist evangelical. We had vastly different perspectives on how the world operated. But Fostovsky was a very philosophically astute guy, and he knew that the initial, the answer to one of our first and most important questions was, does God exist? And for me, I said yes. And for him, he said, I don't really think so. And he knew that because of that difference, there were going to be certain types of trajectories that each of us would go on. And that doesn't mean that because I said yes, therefore you have to be a young Earth creationist. Obviously not. But he understood that my trajectory went off in a direction that could lead to something like young Earth creationism based on some of the other beliefs and ideas and things that I affirm, right? Whereas he is not going to come to some of those conclusions. So we could actually debate and talk amongst each other about all the data up at the top, right? We could talk about whether Archaeopteryx was a bird or a dinosaur, or whether this was a good evolutionary sequence, or whether it was a really, unconvincing one, or things like that. And it wouldn't challenge him to his soul, because he was very comfortable with the decision that he made, that he didn't think that God existed. He was also astute enough to know he couldn't say no, because then he would know everything and he'd be God. So kind of self-defeating there. So he'd say, no, I suspect God doesn't exist. I go off in this direction. You think God does exist, and you go off in this direction. So he understood why we got there. So we could be comfortable talking about that. So with all these different creation organizations that say things like this, like we have the same data, but just different interpretations, what this series seems to be saying is there are no different interpretations. Even within young Earth creationism, you've got to go with our interpretations of this, and not sound like you like evolutionists or sound like you agree with evolutionists in any way. Otherwise, you're dangerous and you're going to be, confusing people. To which I kind of look at my life experience and say, I spent a lot of time around evolutionists of both theistic and non-theistic sorts. And a lot of them are nice, and sometimes they have good arguments. There's a reason why the majority of scientists think that evolution is true. It actually has a good bit of evidence going for it. But like any court case, you can have a really solid case, you can have a really solid argument, you can even get a conviction, and it turns out to be incorrect. And I think that's the sort of dynamic that isn't being picked up here by the authors of this series, is that a story can have, in fact, a lot of evidence, right? That this point here, and they come to it a couple of times in this bullet set from Ken Ham. It comes up 2 other times about evidence and let's see, how do they put it? I think I've got it here. Yeah. In the second bullet, they say, causes people to think that secular evolutionists are correct in saying the evidence supports molecules demand evolution. Well, no young Earth creationist thinks that the evidence ultimately supports that type of evolution. So we're looking at, does evolution have some evidence that is compelling for its case? Sure. Molecules demand evolution? That I don't think that any of the, quote, dangerous creationists out there are making that case or implying that or confusing people in that way. Then a couple of bullets down again, you see some creationist researchers use the term evidence to imply that the supposed evidence found in nature, rather than just the interpretations of it, supports evolution. Again, not kind of grasping that evidence is there for all of us, and that some stories make better use of that evidence than others. And so if my evolutionary colleagues put together a series of fossils and say this represents a transitional series, right? This is a good evidence for evolution. One could say yes to that. One could also point to it and say no. There isn't good evidence in this lineage. You've got major structures, new organs, new features that need to be evolved, and this series doesn't show how any of that happened. Right? You've got these massive jumps or whatever. So I think that's important for your viewers and for other young Earth creationists who might be listening to this and wondering kind of what's going on within creationism here, is that the evidence of the natural world simply is what it is. There's I don't get my evidence and my evolutionary colleagues get their evidence. We all have this big pile of data called the world: biological, astronomical, geological, chemical, physical, like historical, all the bits of it. And what we're doing is we're basically, rummaging around trying to find stuff. And when we do, that adds to the pile of discovered material. And the goal of the young Earth creationist or the old Earth creationist or the theistic evolutionist or the agnostic, right, is to try to create within their own mind first a compelling story that makes sense of the evidence that they see. And for those who want to express that to others, right, to be able to create a compelling story that others would recognize as being powerful and explanatory. And so I think evolutionists have the chance to do that. And I think young Earth creationists, old Earth creationists, et cetera, everybody's got a chance to do that.
I would be really curious to know of an example. This bullet point sort of stuck out to me as we read through it. Is there any example that you know of a creationist doing this, using the term evidence to imply that the supposed evidence found in nature supports evolution?
Well, there's a few juicy quotes out there from a couple of young Earth creationists that are the targets of this. And perhaps this will get us a chance to kind of name some of the people that we might be talking about here over the course of the next few minutes. One of them coming up, no doubt, on this is going to be Todd Wood. Now, Todd Wood is a biochemist. He taught for many years at Bryan College in Tennessee and now heads up Core Academy of Science, a small creation ministry. And Todd had a blog, still does. It was rather well trafficked. And he once, had a blog article talking about that there's lots of evidence for evolution. He even used the term like there's gobs of evidence for evolution. And you don't usually hear a young Earth creationist say that sort of thing, right? And so that gets other young Earth creationists very nervous, and it makes critics of young Earth creationism very happy, right? Because here you have like the honest creationist who's willing to say that evolution has gobs of evidence or the like. But in the end, right, the whole thrust of Todd's article was to say, stop saying that there's no evidence for evolution. That's a terrible argument to make. It's just, you're not telling people the truth if you're saying there's no evidence for evolution. Because even if evolution is not true, it doesn't mean that there aren't evidences that can comport with the idea. And I think that's where Answers in Genesis is kind of coming down here, is that because evolution is false, right, according to their view, and to mine as well, as far as molecules to man evolution, right, this whole writ large cosmic and biological evolution, because I believe that is false, ultimately, I don't think that there is compelling evidence for its case. I don't think that it's ultimately correct. But that doesn't mean that you can't look at the evidence and say, yeah, there's a lot of stuff here that makes sense in this perspective. And that's what Todd Wood's article really was doing, saying, stop making claims that there's no evidence for evolution when there is, and be more careful about this. There's actually a lot of evidence for evolution. And if we tell our students, or especially, high school students, then they go off to college and they find out that there's, all these evidences that are presented in their biology classes and whatnot, that's going to do a lot of damage to them, right? You're risking things. And this is a common argument amongst young Earth creationists, theistic evolutionists, old Earth creationists. We all kind of point at each other and say, the way you're doing it is going to put people's faith in jeopardy. And that's because we all think that, right? We all think that the other person is incorrect here. But I wish that we could do this in a little bit more constructive sort of fashion. But we all share that same concern. And I recognize that as a powerful and a valid concern.
Yeah, I was thinking about an analogy that might help here, is that there's a lot of atheists. I mean, that's the primary target of Capturing Christianity is sort of atheistic apologetics. And there's a whole range of atheists that will make the claim that there's no evidence for the existence of God. And I've made the point before, like, don't say that. Even as an atheist, if you think that reality doesn't include a God, like, don't say that there's no evidence for a God. Just say that you're not convinced of the evidence that does exist for it. And so I think the same would apply in the case of the sort of same point is being made by, was his name Todd? Is that the...
Yes, Todd Wood.
Todd Wood. Yeah, I think he's making a similar point. Like, there is evidence that goes that way, but there's a difference between having some evidence and having sufficient evidence. Like, you can admit that there's some evidence for theism. You can admit that as an atheist, but then you might just hold that the majority of the evidence or the total evidence sort of supports atheism over theism, something along those lines. And so the same would apply in virtually any other area of inquiry. So, like, when it comes to young Earth creationism, evolution, you can argue or at least accept that there are pieces of data that are better supported by this other hypothesis, but that doesn't mean that in the end, when you weigh all of the evidence, that's where you're going to go. And this is just sort of part of being intellectually mature, I would say, is that you've got to realize that reality is complex and mixed, and it's difficult to ascertain completely. And so it's totally, I think, a mature viewpoint to have, is that there's going to be pieces of data that point away from your view, and there's going to be pieces of data that point toward your view. And that's totally acceptable. We're adults, and we can accept that.
Yeah, there was a recent article on the Gospel Coalition. I think it came this week or late last. The article was on March 8th, and it's called "Weaker Assertion to Stronger Argument." And it flows nicely along this line that you're talking about here, that you can actually make a stronger argument for yourself when you back away from an overzealous claim. Mm-hmm. And the context of this article was... Yeah, that's right. The context for this article happened to be whether there are any arguments for moral realism within atheism, and basically saying, if you say there's none, then your opponent only has to make some kind of claim that's workable. They don't have to make a good one. They don't have to make a strong claim. They don't have to make something that's really plausible. They just have to make something that can exist. And now your argument has been defeated, right? Because if you say there's no arguments for moral realism in atheism, and it turns out there is one, well, what does that do for you, right? So their argument is make the weaker claim that arguments for moral realism from an atheistic perspective are weaker than those from theism. And now what you've got is a situation where an atheistic argument has got to show itself to be at least on par with a theistic claim for moral realism, if not better, right? If you want somebody to change their mind on something that they already believe, you've got to explain all the facts that they already have. And then you've got to be able to say that your approach explains those facts and more. And so, what we're seeing here with some of this stuff from Answers in Genesis and some other young Earth creationists, I kind of hate to say, the Institute for Creation Research piled on this a year ago, but their president backed off and said, we apologize for talking about young Earth evolutionists. But the writer for Answers in Genesis used that as cover to start bringing up this topic. So this has been something that's been brewing, but Answers in Genesis has the biggest platform, certainly, and they're being the most aggressive, creating this, probably like 10-part, 12-part series going after individuals. So Todd Wood is one of them. He says that there's evidence for evolution. And what he means by that is that there's plenty of evidence that evolution explains really well and creationism might struggle with, young Earth creationism would struggle with. So we have to be honest with people about that. And otherwise, we're setting them up for a fall. Some other people, Dr. Kurt Wise,
before we get to these other resources, I'm really excited to get to them. But I just kind of wanted to tag something onto that, which I think may serve people. I was developing an argument. I think I may have been working on my debate with Stephen Woodford, and I think Stephen and I both would talk to other people and sort of get some other ideas and new perspectives on the things that we were arguing. And so one day I called Josh Rasmussen up to just sort of discuss things. And this didn't even have anything to do with the actual substance of the debate. It was a debate on the Kalam cosmological argument. But he made the point, he was just like, make your argument more modest. And when you do that, it's actually going to make it a whole lot stronger because it's less difficult to attack. And I think that goes perfectly in line with what you were saying. It seems counterintuitive, though. It seems like to make a strong argument, you've got to make the strongest claims possible. But if you actually make your argument more modest, then say you may even believe, like you may think that the evidence for young Earth creationism is so strong. But in your actual claim, you might make something that is a whole lot more modest. And what that does is it's a whole lot easier to defend, a lot more difficult to respond to. And so in turn, you make your argument or your claim, you make it a whole lot stronger by making it more modest. And I think that's just a very important sort of dialectical point to maybe keep in mind. And this goes way beyond the young Earth creationism debate, right? It can go into so many different areas. But yeah, let's turn to some of these other resources that we'd like to get out. And again, this is part of the reason for this stream is to just make people aware that there are reasonable young Earth creationists that are doing good work, and it's important to highlight them. And just like, I mean, that's one of my goals with Capturing Christianity is to make people aware of some of these really, really brilliant Christian thinkers that you just didn't know about, and Capturing Christianity helped expose them to you. So let's mention some of these other guys doing some good work here.
Yeah. So, well, Todd Wood has got a podcast with another young Earth creationist from the UK, Paul Garner. So Todd is a biochemist. Paul is a geologist, and they have a podcast called Let's Talk Creation, which comes out every other week. And it's really sharp. It's smart. It's occasionally funny. Most of the time, they're going through some really interesting discussions, and the modest claim is the sort of thing that they like to reside in, right? And the last one that I was watching them talk about was, the genealogies in Genesis 5 and 11, which most young Earth creationists look at and say, yeah, this is one of the reasons why I am a young Earth creationist and not some other type of creationist, right? And so, yeah, that you can see there down towards the bottom, they've got another one on Behemoth and Leviathan, and going through biblical scholarship on this, what people from a variety of different perspectives have thought about these things over time. Yeah, this is a podcast by a couple of young Earth creationists, but these guys are very widely read, and they pay attention to the perspectives of things far outside of young Earth creationism. A really great one, if you want to lose your lunch, is that one on parasites. They've got a good friend of mine, Dr. Jeremy Blaschke. He's a entomologist. He studies insects, but he especially studies parasites and parasitoids, wasps and things like that do absolutely terrible things to creatures. And so it's a really neat one about, how do young Earth creationists deal with questions like, why would a good God make something like these parasites and parasitoids? And that's an interesting thing to kind of work your way through. So I would highly recommend people take a look at what Let's Talk Creation. If they want a podcast that they can listen to from a couple of young Earth creationists that aren't going to feel like you're getting your head pounded, because they're not calling people compromisers or evolutionists, although Paul Gardner is a British guy, so you will hear the word evolution said in that unique British style there, but he's not talking down to anybody. So yeah, there are just a great pair of guys. I've worked with both of them in the past, and they're two of the people who have been mentioned. Todd very specifically and aggressively being worked against in this series. Paul's been mentioned. You can kind of tell from reading they're not terribly happy with him, but they didn't say anything specifically bad about him either. He heads up a really good organization in the UK called Biblical Creation Trust. And likewise, in that case, you just have a little bit of that kind of British cordiality working for you, where you've got a creation group that is, again, going to be passionate, is going to make the case for their perspective, but isn't going to be nasty or spiteful or tough on you if you happen to disagree. So those are a couple of resources there. Some of the other people that are in the line of fire here is Kurt Wise. He's a paleontologist like myself. His background is from the University of Chicago and from Harvard University. And so that's one of the things Ken Ham says later on down in this article. He kind of says, even if somebody has a degree from a great institution like Harvard or Yale or Princeton, that's a slight directly at Kurt Wise because he comes from Harvard. And he got his degree under Stephen Jay Gould, who was perhaps America's foremost evolutionary thinker of the second half of the 20th century, and a very passionate evolutionist and anti-creationist. I mean, Steve Gould testified in courts against young Earth creationism when there were legal challenges to whether you could or could not teach creationism in public schools. So Kurt is a tremendously deep thinker. He's got a great book called Faith, Form, and Time, but it's out of print. And yeah, you're showing here the Is Genesis History website, and he was one of the scholars interviewed on that. I was as well. In fact, that's kind of a bit of a theme. You'll see a number of the people who are kind of in the line of fire are folks involved in this movie, Is Genesis History. But that video also has some staff from Answers in Genesis, Dr. Andrew Snelling, a geologist. It has staff from Creation Ministries International, Dr. Rob Carter. Those guys aren't in the line of fire, but a few of the others in this movie kind of are and have been. But Kurt's another person who will say things like, yeah, the evolutionary argument for this particular transitional series looks strong, but Kurt has also been at the forefront of crafting and creating methodologies that creationists use in order to distinguish one kind of animal from another. If young Earth creationism affirms, which it does, that God created animals according to what the Bible calls kinds, it's just the Hebrew word min, and it's every bit as plastic as our word for kind. But we know that God said that in Genesis 1, he created different kinds of land animals. There were beasts of the field and creeping things and livestock. There were different kinds of birds, different kinds of trees and plants and whatnot. So Kurt has been at the forefront, along with Todd Wood, at developing methodologies to take data sets of anatomical information and process them in such a way and look at them and say, we're going to look at these in clustering programs, ones that are used widely, not just like some niche young Earth creationist thing, and see if we see cluster patterns or whether or not things are kind of evenly spread about. If they're evenly spread about, then that still looks like a good candidate for evolution. But if you see a bunch of taxa clustered here, and then there's a big space in the diagram, there's another cluster here and something else down at the bottom, you're looking at it and we've got three measurably distinct groups of organisms. These might represent three different kinds within some group that you happen to be looking at. So again, you've got people who affirm all the things that young Earth creationists do, attempting to work with the data on a firsthand kind of basis, right? Grabbing data sets that you might get from an evolutionary paper on some group, let's say, for example, horses, and do horses evolve from small little horses with multiple toes over time into the large horse that we have today that has just one toe, and there's changes in the molars and the tooth structure and the skull. There's all these sorts of changes. And do those represent a group of animals that are actually united as a single group, or are there multiple groups to them? What sort of evolution, in a sense, are young Earth creationists capable of accepting? Because all young Earth creationists believe that there has been speciation. No young Earth creationist believes that the species that we see alive today are the same ones that God created initially back in the beginning in Genesis 1 and are represented in the Garden of Eden, for example. All of us believe that God took representatives of those kinds, whatever they were. Those were what went on board the ark. And since that time, the animals that departed the ark, they have speciated into the diversity of animals that we see alive today, and probably some of the other recent fossil forms as well. So Answers in Genesis believes in speciation, which according to some definitions means evolution, right? And macroevolution. Now, I don't think that one species of, say, finch evolving into another species of finch is like really that big of a deal. You might call that macroevolution from a biological standpoint. Honestly, for those of us in the paleontological side, we don't consider that macroevolution. We consider macroevolution the development of large-scale forms, structures, functions, things like that. So I would say that evolution is fairly limited in the way that it operates within a kind and brings about diversification and diversity, and that's diversity of species. And there might be 15, 20, or 100 species that come out of a kind in the post-flood world. We don't know. We have to investigate what those all are. But none of us think that, for example, the primates and the carnivores, monkeys and, say, bears, share a common ancestor. We would look at those as different kinds and possibly multiple kinds within the groups. So Kurt Wise has been one of the people who's been most influential in helping us think about those issues in the past, and spawned off a whole kind of investigative series led by Todd Wood in some of his methodologies to investigate these things. And again, it's data driven. It's not based on evolutionary assumptions. It's based on, what does this bone look like? What does this organism do? Do these two animals mate with one another? Do we have any record of that? Because if they mate with one another, they're probably part of the same kind rather than being completely separate kinds. And those are the types of things that most young Earth creationists actually agree about. What Answers in Genesis is trying to say here is, though, these guys, they think too much. Too much has happened. And so they'll pull an interesting quote, or even in the case of Kurt, amusing quote. It's just kind of thinking like, hey, what about this? Is this possible? And they're like, hey, he thinks this is possible, and that's totally wrong. That's way too much evolution. He's been evolutionized. And we can't trust him, even if he's got a PhD from Harvard. It's kind of a subtle, or not so subtle, anti-intellectualism that's lobbed in this article, where they mentioned that. They mentioned college professors, and things like that, which, would be Matt McLean, another person, and another paleontologist. See an interesting recurring theme here? We got a lot of geologists and paleontologists involved in this. And part of that, I think, is because those of us who've been through programs in geology and paleontology, we tend to think historically more about things than your average biologist does, or your average chemist, because they don't explore, unless they're in evolutionary biology, which would be like what Todd Wood did. Right? His biochemistry was largely evolutionary biology. So those of us who tend to think in historical terms come up, I think, with sometimes a little bit more of the bolder arguments, but hopefully some of the more nuanced arguments as well. And Answers in Genesis is trying to hold firmer to those stronger claims of certainty, when a bunch of us are trying to say, well, yeah, but there's some issues here. And they don't want issues. They want answers, after all, right? They're answers in Genesis.
Yeah, it just, the more I hear you talk about this issue, it just kind of seemed just defensive on their part, Answers in Genesis, which is unfortunate. I did want to kind of switch gears a little bit, if you don't mind. And I'd like to get you to give me a kind of sort of elevator pitch for young Earth creationism from your perspective, obviously, because I think that you've got a unique way of looking at things, and some of the things that you and I talked about at the conference, I was like, this is the first time I'm hearing about this. So I guess give me like an elevator pitch for young Earth creationism. And I guess what I'm more interested in is, because I think I'm pretty familiar with like the sort of the biblical case that can be made for young Earth creationism. So I'd be more interested in, some of the science, some of the sort of natural facts that you would appeal to in order to sort of defend the young Earth view, because I don't think that the majority of our audience will be familiar with that sort of data that are getting appealed to, especially like the contemporary scene. So I think that would be very interesting for people to hear maybe for the first time. And so when you do that, I'd like to know, where would you put, I think I even asked Dr. William Lane Craig this question in class the other day, and I don't think he had even heard of it. But the soft tissue that's been found in dinosaur bones and all that, would you place that on the spectrum of like, so this is some really interesting or good evidence for young Earth creationism, or where would that fall on the spectrum?
Yeah, I think that it is strong evidence for young Earth creationism. So for the audience that might not be familiar with this, the first report of original and unfossilized soft tissue still preserved from dinosaur bones was reported in 2005 in the journal Science by Mary Schweitzer and a team of other researchers. She's from NC State, but was working with the Museum of the Rockies and Jack Horner. Jack Horner was the model for the paleontologist in the Jurassic Park series, for example. So we're talking about somebody who is a legend in paleontology, and rightly so. And so Schweitzer was...
Can I stop you real quick? So, okay, in 2005, were you already a paleontologist? Where were you? Put me on a timeline of like your background. Like how big of a discovery was this for you in your life?
This was groundbreaking. I mean, it really was. This was a shocking discovery and report. So for context, like how old am I and when this was going on? I was in my PhD program. And actually, I had just moved to Lynchburg to start my job at Liberty University. I was still finishing off my PhD. I had another chapter and a half to write for my dissertation. So I was trying to, finish things up as I was going on there. So this was reported... Yeah, I think this was reported probably in the fall of 2005, somewhere right around there. So I was finishing up my PhD, and Schweitzer had a previous article in the past where she thought that she had found some original dinosaur DNA, but nobody believed it, and there were too many problems with the methodologies that she couldn't quite make the case hard. This one came out. And I remember she showed a video of her using a set of tweezers, and they have like this little bit of goop here from some biological material. She's grabbing it and pulling it, and then she lets it go, and it stretches back into shape. And it was a blood vessel, basically. So what she discovered in this paper, what she reported in this paper, was that inside the femur, the upper thigh bone of a Tyrannosaurus rex, it was all fossilized on the outside. But when it was broken open, there were original dinosaur biological tissues still preserved. They had demineralized the bone and accidentally demineralized too much, and there was still this stuff in there, which shouldn't have been the case if it was purely fossil. So they did the procedure again, right? Good science. Wait, that made weird results. Tried again. It happened again. And they were able to identify things like, basically veins and arteries and things like that, and possibly even red blood cells in the thigh bone here. This was met with shock and actually quite a bit of skepticism from the evolutionary community, because soft organismal tissues have a very limited horizon for stability. And it didn't seem very likely that a bone that's 68 million years old, which is the date assigned to this particular T-Rex fossil, could possibly have intact biological tissues. And Schweitzer at that point had no idea how it might happen. She's just reporting, this is what we have, and this looks suspiciously like original material. So some people postulated maybe it was bacteria that had gotten in and secreted goop that ended up, looking a lot like these things. Maybe it formed a coating inside the walls of where there used to be a blood vessel. And so now you've got this tough bacterial stuff. And so there was some pretty strong criticism of Schweitzer coming out in 2007 and 2008 from some labs that were replicating some of this stuff and making things that looked pretty similar to the T-Rex. But Schweitzer is tenacious. She went back and continued working on the T-Rex, and also another fossil from a deeper geological unit in Montana, a duck-billed dinosaur from an 80 million year old layer. Now, obviously, as a young Earth creationist, I'm disagreeing about the absolute age, but nonetheless, the stratigraphy is this stuff is lower and deeper down, and in a conventional perspective, another 12 million years older than the T-Rex. And this duck-billed dinosaur resulted in the same stuff. In fact, even better, not only did they have the branching blood vessels, but right in between where the blood vessels split is a cell, something called an osteocyte or an osteoblast. They're the same thing. They're bone-forming cells. And they're always located at the junction point or split point between blood cells because they need a lot of blood in order to build the bone around themselves. And she compared that with ostrich material, and they were the same. Then they tagged antibodies with a fluorescent marker and put them in. And these antibodies were going to grip onto very specific proteins that are only found in vertebrate animals, so no bacteria. And they identified collagen and a couple of others. And so these antibodies grabbed onto the collagen, and that's the only material on Earth that they can grab onto. And then when they hit it with fluorescent light, they got a little flash of color indicating that, yeah, the antibody had actually grabbed onto it. Weird analogy, but it's like a pregnancy test. Right? Those pregnancy tests that give you the little plus or the 2 lines or what have you can do that with 99.99% accuracy, even when they come from the Dollar Tree, right? It doesn't matter because antibodies fit like a hand into the glove of a protein, and only one antibody attaches to one protein. So it's basically the same deal. And Schweitzer was able to show that we've got vertebrate-specific proteins and vertebrate-specific structures inside not only a T-Rex, but also a duck-billed dinosaur. And then other people started finding them in other places. Most of them evolutionists, but also some young Earth creationists identified original material from the horn core, the brow horn, the nose horn of Triceratops. And, got all these stretchy, elastic tissue materials. And Schweitzer has been on the hunt to try and find a chemistry that can stabilize these materials. She hopes that there is some way in which iron can bind up the oxygen in these bones so that the oxygen doesn't go around and destroy everything, because that's pretty much what oxygen does. It's an amazing device of God that he decides to make us breathe this stuff because it's quite toxic. But the reason why it's toxic is because it's very biologically active. And we need that for respiration, but it also is the key ingredient for decomposition. And so she needs something inside the bone to grab that oxygen and hold on to it and try and keep it from doing anything else. And she thinks that the iron inside the blood from all of the blood production might be able to do that. There's a couple other researchers that just saw a paper that came out last week, and I haven't read it yet, but it's up on one of the many tabs to get to it. And somebody's saying, here's another scenario. But the whole approach here is to try and come up with some scenario that might make these molecules last for 68, 80 million, 200 million years in age. Quite honestly, I don't see how that's really possible. And I'm not a biochemist, but I'm a paleontologist, and I have a good familiarity with biology, generally speaking. I was in a biology department for 15 years, which was great. And these biological chemicals, even things like collagen, which are really durable, under the best circumstances where we keep these things in a -80 freezer to try and just keep them as cold as possible and retard the effect of biochemical degradation. We can even measure their degradation every time we pull them out of the -80 freezer. And Schweitzer was able to identify the breakdown of her own T-Rex samples over several years in which they were studying them. So, I mean, my goodness, right? You're trying to do everything you can to preserve these. And as soon as they get out in the open, and then you put them away out of the open, they still continue to break down. So this seems to tell me that there's a very finite horizon for this. And sure, the models might say that collagen can extend in life for 2 million years, but that's not 68. That's not 80. We're talking, 2 orders of magnitude difference here between ideal laboratory conditions versus out there in the real world in a rock that is sitting there at 60 degrees and has been warmer in the past, and that sort of thing. So I think that the soft tissue is a strong argument that the bones inside these rocks are young. And if the bones inside the rocks are young, then the rocks themselves have got to be young as well.
Is Schweitzer, is that how you say her name? Is she, I take it that she's not a young Earth creationist.
No. In fact, she was a young Earth creationist earlier on in her life, and after going on and getting a degree at the museum at Montana State University and working under Jack Horner, her position changed. She moved into a theistic evolution perspective. I'm not sure where she is in her faith journey at this particular point, and I know that she is. She doesn't really appreciate young Earth creationists using these data as an argument in her favor. So I'm not saying any of this to say that Schweitzer thinks the Earth is young. Please, the listeners, be clear about that. Schweitzer does not believe that one bit at all. But again, this gets back to the point of there is evidence and there is interpretation of those evidences. And I think in this case, the interpretation of the evidence favors a young Earth and disfavors an old Earth. That doesn't mean that young Earth is right. All right. It doesn't mean that an ancient Earth is right. It just means that in this particular case, I think that young Earth creationists are in a really good situation, looking at what we know from biology, which is a whole lot. This is not an argument from ignorance. This isn't like a gaps in the fossil record type of argument. This is, we know how these biological molecules behave, and we know how they behave under a wide array of conditions, and they don't seem to comport with. Basically, they're staying still forever. And that's really what 68 and 80 million years old are. It's like, that's forever.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, I just want to reiterate that this is not, and you're not treating this. And this is one of the reasons why I like you so much, is that you're not saying that like, this is the definitive proof of young Earth creationism. We've got this data that just demolishes. Like, no, you're saying that here's some data and this is one way to interpret it. And just so happens that you think that this supports the young Earth creationist view. And some people could accept that and just say, well, okay, we do have some evidence for young Earth creationism, but then I think that the balance of the evidence goes the other way. And so I think that people could take that position. Oops, hit my microphone. People could take that position. Wouldn't be any big deal. But yeah, nevertheless, very, very interesting stuff. This, I think when I met you at CCV2, that was the first time I had even heard about this, and it was really cool, really interesting stuff. And because I kind of at this point wanted to just like ask you for more data and more evidence, but I want to just leave the audience sort of enticed and interested. And so if you would like to learn more about Dr. Ross's ministry and everything else that he's doing, please check out the links in the description of this video. If you'd like to have him back on the show to maybe talk more about this, or we could even get some more of the people that he's mentioned, I'm sure that he's friends with, then it'd be fun to get some different perspectives on this. This is not a sort of Catholic, Orthodox, Protestant issue. There's diversity among the sort of major denominations here. So this is not like a thing that is defining of Protestantism or anything like that. It's a sort of open question for the vast majority of Christians. So that's one of the reasons why we're kind of investigating it. It's just a sort of interesting topic, even apart from the sort of biblical data, which those arguments can go on for forever. But the scientific stuff, that to me, I guess that's just a very interesting aspect of this. But I would like to allow you a chance to just swinging back to the original intent of this stream was to sort of address the attacks on other creationists by Answers in Genesis and Ken Ham and everything. What would you like to sort of leave? Suppose that Ken Ham actually ended up watching this entire stream. What would you like to say to him right now?
Well, first off, I'd say, Ken, you know me, and we have worked together in the past quite often. I wrote for Answers Magazine, as Ken would know, for the better part of 6 or 7 years. Rather frequently, I had 10, 12 articles or so with them. Until at one point, I kind of stopped getting invitations. And I know from the people who work at Answers in Genesis, that was mostly because of the dinosaurs and feathers thing. which I actually went to the Creation Museum and I gave a talk on that very topic in 2014 when I went to visit them. They had a new Allosaurus skeleton, and I went to identify it. I rechecked the identification. I gave them a nice talk about how we know these sorts of things. But also, this was a topic that was building within creationism. And so I gave a talk about Archaeopteryx and fossils and dinosaurs and feathers. And Ken would remember he got a chance to ask the first question before he had to leave. We've shared the stage together, Ken. Right. In 2009, you came to Liberty University with Andrew Snelling, and the two of you, plus myself and David DeWitt, gave big presentations at Thomas Road Baptist Church together. I wrote the entries in the Dictionary of Christianity and Science for you and for Answers in Genesis after having a 2.5 hour long conversation with you on the phone, a very good one. I've been in your office, we've talked. And these types of things that you're doing right now are doing great damage to other young earth creationists. You're attacking their credibility, you're attacking their livelihood, you're attacking their motives. And that's, on the one side, very unseemly. It's also quite uncharacteristic of people displaying the fruits of the Spirit. I would implore Ken Ham to cease and desist on this. This isn't about evolutionary assumptions. It isn't about people who are agreeing with evolutionists and trying to sneak something into the church. This is about a group of scholars that have a slightly different opinion on the most minor of issues within creationism. It's not a slippery slope to make an argument that evolution has a few places where its explanations are better than ours. It's okay to say that because it actually builds up better credibility with our audience, I think. So I would say to Ken, as someone who has been a friend and a supporter, someone who has constantly pointed people to your website and to your museum, to the Ark Encounter, as someone who is a fellow colleague in Young Earth Creationism and what I consider a co-laborer in the right perspective, please stop. Call up these folks and apologize. And if we need mediation, I will help in any way. If there's some way for us to get together in a room with the others that are involved here. But this approach of attacking Young Earth Creationists and calling them names like Young Earth Evolutionists is factually incorrect and irresponsible. We should do and strive for better. So Ken, if you are listening, I'd like to help, if at all possible. Rely on our past friendship and see if we can move forward towards something better.
All right. Well, Dr. Ross, I really appreciate you coming back on to the show to discuss this and just to kind of reintroduce you to the Capturing Christianity audience. I really do hope that people kind of research more about who you are and what you're all about and discover the great work that you're doing. So I really appreciate you coming on, and hopefully we can do this again sometime soon.
Well, thank you for providing such a welcome platform to have me in and to dialogue about a peculiar subject, certainly. But I appreciate the work that you and the team are doing, and I certainly wish you guys the best. May you continue to proclaim the name of Jesus till he returns.
Amen. All right. Well, we will see you guys in the next Capturing Christianity video. I've got one out coming tomorrow. Still got to make a thumbnail for it, but I'm looking forward to chatting with Nate Sala, I believe is his name, from Wise Disciple. So be on the lookout for that. I'll see you guys in the next Capturing Christianity video. See you very soon. Hey, it's me again. Actually, don't leave yet. I've got something super, super important to tell you. So first of all, you're awesome. Like you just watched a really, really long video just now, and you're still watching it. That is actually pretty amazing. Secondly, we have hundreds, literally hundreds of other apologetics related videos for you to watch on our channel. Go check them out. I've interviewed exorcists, hosted debates between Christians and atheists. I've even made response videos to atheists. All of that is available on our channel. Go check it out. Third, I rely on people that see value in my work, people like you that watch videos to the very end, to keep the lights on around here. Literally, this is how I feed my family. So if you see value in the work that I do, please consider supporting this ministry and becoming a patron. Links to that are in the description. Oh, and have I mentioned that Christianity is true?